powers. And this has implications, of course, to how member states respond to various issues today. I'm being open-ended on that, so if you're interested, we can always discuss later. This is just a figure of ASEAN population. Okay, in total, 665 million. This is the data from 2022. Very large, bigger than the EU combined. So it's a robust area, very fertile, arable lands, rich in natural resources, strategically located. And these populations, if you look at these numbers, you know, the composition, the sharing, Indonesia being the largest share, 40%, beyond more than 40%, are not just big in numbers, but they are also young. They are also young. For those studying economics would know the meaning of this. You are big and you are young. It can be two possibilities, right? It's a labor force, number one, and second one, it's an important market in the world of capitalism. So you notice which country is younger than others, right? The Indonesia, for instance, is relatively young. If you look at the color red, yeah, the productive age between 20 and 54. Indonesia is still relatively very young. Malaysia, and then Vietnam. Three largest, very productive. And Brunei, well, because its number is so small, so you don't quite mention that. Vietnam in total is about 90 million, so it's significant. Malaysia, it's interesting because its total population is only about here. Malaysia is only about 32 million in population, but it's interestingly much younger than Singapore. Small, but older. We don't call it old, but older. All right. So other countries that are not in the, you know, that I mentioned means they are growing into the aging stage. Now, if you are big, you are young, but you are poor, then that's a problem. Here in Southeast Asia, they are very promising. They are not necessarily poor. Some of them has very good purchasing power. You notice Singapore here, the purchasing power parity figure. Brunei Darussalam, Malaysia, Indonesia, pretty good purchasing power, you know, to drive the economy forward. GDP per capita needs to be balanced with Gini coefficient, right? Because there's an issue of discrepancy in wealth among groups usually. But if you adjust it by purchasing power parity, then you start seeing the capacity of people to spend. So ASEAN is relatively good. And it's the size of the population correlates in a positive way to you know, relatively good purchasing power. How about trade? Do they buy from each other, or do they buy and support other economies? Now, as I said earlier, across the years, intra-trade has been tried to be pushed, to be more and more intra-trade among countries. The challenge, and you look at the numbers. You look at the numbers and you look at the spread of trade, intra-ASEAN trade. Where, between which country intra-trade is very robust? Between the big countries or among the big countries, or the small countries intra-trade is big? And you see the pattern? Okay, think about it. Think about it. Whether small countries trade more with ASEAN member states, among ASEAN member states, or it's the larger country actually doing more active intra-trade. And also compare it with the extra trade, extra ASEAN trade numbers. And I'm going more into this extra trade now. The extra trade number is particularly interesting because if you start comparing trade opportunities in the region, you start seeing that trade is inevitably tend to be between emerging countries and the much more advanced countries. This has been what's going on in ASEAN. So this number in particular is talking also about the investment. But investment is key to trade, right? If your country invests a lot into a certain country, then most likely you would also buy from that country because you produce products that they can be sold back to your country. Now, you can see that foreign investment is unequally distributed across ASEAN. Look at this picture on the left. Singapore received the biggest number of foreign investment. But of course, with the number of population of only 5.4 million, it cannot be all swallowed by themselves, right? Singapore investment are mainly redistributed to other countries in the region. It goes to Indonesia, it goes to Vietnam, it goes to Malaysia. So it's just temporarily being parked. The investment is only temporarily being parked in Singapore. Singapore is a hub. They provide offices, they provide currency, they provide facilities, different kinds of facilities, including legal facilities, to allow investors to feel comfortable, read the situation in the region, learn about the region from Singaporeans, and then they usually start operating or opening plants, operating factories in the target country, which is why this number has always been impressive. Singapore is the stop for ASEAN investment, and they're very good at welcoming investments. Now, the biggest investment is from the United States. And it has been significant increase since the pandemic ends in the sector of banking, finance, electronics, biomedical, and pharmaceutical. China's investment has also been increasing, and it's increasing very significantly, up to 96%, mostly in manufacturing, in electronic vehicle, in digital economy, and also in infrastructure and real estate. The third investor that's also big is Japan. And Japan's investment has been mainly on manufacturing, including electronic vehicles. Now, the graph on the top, you can see there has been increase on investment in financial and insurance. Manufacturing has been very steep increase. Wholesale and retail slightly decline. Real estate, just a slight increase. Information and communication, also an increase, but relatively low in total. So these are the areas of areas attractive to foreign investors. And the investing countries are US, China, and Japan mainly. The EU is number 4, by the way, if it's occurs to your attention. So that's the situation of the economy. So imagine that. Imagine that's how countries relate to each other in this part of the region. Then we look back at the declaration, Bangkok Declaration, the time on which member states of ASEAN were only 5. And at that time, the situation was very uncertain. It was very bloody relationship between countries. very sensitive. Everybody can just trigger conflicts, open conflicts between each other. Notice how the leadership of ASEAN settle this problem of trust. Read the content of this, and hopefully you can capture what are the purpose for ASEAN establishment at that time. Economic growth was mentioned. Regional peace and stability was mentioned. But interestingly, they put economic growth together with peaceful community. And peaceful community can only be achieved through political security cooperation. So activating cooperation at the economic level doesn't go directly into investment between countries or directly in fighting investment, but more importantly at that time was to bring everybody to the level of economic, sociocultural, technical ability. And how to do so? Provide assistance to each other, collaborate more effectively so that the sectors that are promising can grow even more. And for those areas that are not yet promising, there will be studies to improve trade, at that time commodity trade, because most ASEAN member states at that time were agricultural, promoting Southeast Asian studies, maintaining cooperation with international and regional organizations, including the United Nations. So that what? So that every avenue possible can be explored and ASEAN can find its path: peace, stability, and then economic prosperity. So that's the logic. And if you notice, at that time, along with the birth of the Bangkok Declaration in 1967, the following machinery was established. So at that time, there was an agreement to have an annual meeting of foreign ministers. It shall be by rotation and referred to as ASEAN Ministerial Meeting. Special meetings can be organized, but then the one who call upon the special meeting, they will be responsible to finance the organizing of it. For issues, there will be a standing committee under the chairmanship of the foreign minister of the host country. They would assign ambassadors or somebody sent as an envoy to carry on the work of association, to have dialogues with foreign ministers so that this issue can be tackled. And then if they need experts on specific subjects, specific topic, then they will form ad hoc committees. If the path is already clear, they may establish a permanent committees of specialists and officials on specific subjects, but only after building an ad hoc committees. What about who runs the administrative issues? Before ASEAN Secretariat was born, every member states dedicate staff as a national secretariat. Each member state dedicate people to carry out the work of the association on behalf of that country, to prepare meetings of foreign ministers, to prepare meetings for the standing committee and also permanent committees. So can you capture the underlying principles why this mechanism was chosen? Read the unwritten. Read the unwritten. It's not just about rotation. It's not just about choosing certain mechanism. But number one, you notice, I actually really want this to be a discussion between you, with you. So I will just start with one, and then if you are somehow interested, you can ask me back and let me know your answer to this. What are the underlying principle? Why this mechanism was chosen? My tips to you, number one, you notice that all member states, the 5 member states at that time, were given the same responsibility. So not one country over another, more superior than other, no. But everybody carry the same responsibility. Can you figure out other unwritten principles underneath this mechanism, why this mechanism was chosen? Please let me know. You can type in your answer. And then partnerships, okay? Just like any other regional cooperation, EU also has its own mechanism, SAARC also has its own mechanism. It's impossible to limit discussions and cooperations only among members. There will be partners, but the point is, how do you call them and what kind of opportunities do you provide to them? With partnership always comes take and give. There's always trade-offs. There's no such thing as free lunch, right? So by inviting partnership, you have to be ready for all consequences. So ASEAN created different mechanisms for partnerships. Everybody, every partner comes with different, what do you call it? Different privilege. So there are ASEAN +1, where the meeting at the higher level is very, very intense and can be at the high level meeting, and it's regularized, like Australia, Canada, India. When I was negotiating for ASEAN, somehow the human rights mechanism meets on regular basis with Australia, with United States, with European Union, almost every time. It's like, you know, they monitor this issue really closely. And then there are countries that are more into the setting of sitting the 3 together. And this is ASEAN's design, you know, it's not wanted by China, North Korea, or Japan. But ASEAN decided that when they talk to China, they will also sit at the same table with South Korea and Japan. So the 3 needs to sit down together at the higher level. So they call the mechanism ASEAN +3. Again, let me know if you know the logic behind it. Last, there's the East Asian Summit. East Asian Summit setting is for 10 ASEAN +8 sitting together. There's the Australia, the 8 includes Australia, China, India, Japan, New Zealand, Republic of Korea, the South Korea, Russia, and the US. ASEAN Summit has different emphasis from ASEAN +3, different emphasis from ASEAN +1. So everything has their own emphasis. And these are the list of dialogue relationship and when they were established. The timing tells a lot about when this relationship between these countries are considered very, very important. And then there are these kinds of partnership, including Pakistan, sectoral dialogue. Other countries taking the format of sectoral dialogues are Norway, Turkey, and Switzerland. There's also special observer, Papua New Guinea, because they're not interested yet to become members, but they have been very closely monitoring meetings. And then there are regional groupings that are also partners with ASEAN. SAARC is part of it. And then development partners include Germany and Chile. And then there are the entities associated with ASEAN, where you can see the presence of parliamentarians, chief of justices, businesses, and so on. So with ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries were able to embrace and engage a large portion of the world. The only territory that we cannot engage yet through ASEAN are mainly Africa and Latin America. But these two, we also engage through this regional groupings. So whenever necessary, we can always do meetings with them. So these are showing the importance of Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific, its overlaps in terms of territory, and the activism of countries in this region is very much high. If you ever wonder about how ASEAN mechanism works today, okay, so we are talking fast forward after that 1967 period. By 1986, we start having our ASEAN Secretariat. And since then, we have the ASEAN Charter. And since the ASEAN Charter, the structure of ASEAN becomes even more elaborate. If you notice at this, what do you call it, hierarchy from the below to the top, the highest decision-making mechanism is the summit. And before going to the ASEAN summit, all materials coming from the national secretariats, from sectoral bodies, from human rights bodies, they go through the ASEAN Coordinating Council. ASEAN Coordinating Council is basically attended by the foreign ministers. Okay, this is another way of describing how ASEAN works. ICHAR, this is a human rights body I was talking about, is working together side by side with the senior official meetings. This is the Director General levels. And every pillar, as written in the ASEAN vision, they have their own sectoral bodies. And then they consult sometimes the ASEAN foreign ministers, and then the human rights body. And then the human rights body is also reporting directly to the foreign ministers. Committee of Permanent Representatives are form of ambassadors, of ASEAN ambassadors. The core is the 10 ASEAN member states. And then they can consult and instruct the ASEAN National Secretariat. And then there is the ASEAN Coordinating Council. Even deeper, if you slice the picture even more, you know, this sectoral bodies, you slice deeper into the staffing, you can imagine how big ASEAN bureaucracy can be. It's very elaborate. If you don't know who to talk to and why you talk to them, and you don't bring the proper letter, and you stop by at the ASEAN Secretariat, you'll be lost. Most likely you'll be rejected at the front door because there are so many possibilities of who to meet. So please be clear of who you are trying to meet. I have a book that was published in 2022 called Human Rights at Risk. In this book, what's interesting is that this is a chapter, by the way, that I wrote, and it's about the human rights mechanism. But what's interesting about this particular chapter is that based on my own experience, I see ASEAN mechanism as quite winding. Yeah, it's not as straightforward as was written before in the previous slides I have. When civil society participated, non-diplomats, civil society organizations, media, and then scholars participate in ASEAN meetings, where are they located? Number one, they are never going to be part of the main organs. So main organs are only for civil servants, for appointed officials. So many other possibilities are available here, which is through the human rights mechanism. So issues affecting people are all packed up together to go through this human rights mechanism. And then when when you want to communicate what needs to be done, you go through the foreign ministers to make sure that your agenda get carried forward to the coordinating council so that the summit can bring your issue up. Up to this point, do you have any questions first? Maybe the last part of my presentation would emphasize more on the current event ongoing in ASEAN. Let me just stop there first to make sure that it's not going too far without you understanding what I'm talking about. Any questions? Any comments?
Can you please tell us about the decision making within ASEAN? For example, whether it requires unilateral, for example, does it allow require all countries to vote on a certain decision, on certain agreement, etc., or is it majority-based voting? Like if majority vote in favor of certain agreement, then it will pass, or otherwise it will be rejected. So what is the decision-making process in ASEAN?
Okay. Second question. Soha.
Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam.
Ma'am, am I audible?
Sorry?
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. I have two questions related to the politics and economy. How does Indonesian politics as the largest economy in ASEAN impact the overall dynamics of the organization?
Okay.
And my second question is, what role does Indonesia play in promoting regional stability and security within the ASEAN context?
Okay. All right. Let me accept one more question. Perhaps it's still linked. Faiza?
Assalamualaikum.
Yes, ma'am.
Firstly, I'd like to say thank you so much for this very informative lecture. It was very nice and it was very informative for all of us. So my question is that I've seen on some of the slides that you have mentioned UN as well. Is UN over ASEAN, and does ASEAN compare with UN in its economic and other matters?
I cannot quite hear you. Can you repeat the question?
Yes, I was asking how influential is UN over ASEAN?
Oh,
ASEAN confer with UN in economic and other matters, because I did see that you have mentioned UN on some of the slides. So I'm wondering, does UN have some role with ASEAN and how in its policy making and everything else?
okay. Thank you. So number one, about the decision-making process in ASEAN. Let me put up again this picture, this one, so it's clearer. The principle of ASEAN decision-making, you can always find in the ASEAN Charter. So you just type in ASEAN Charter on your browser, and you can download it anytime. You can see the principles of ASEAN that needs to be upheld at any time in ASEAN meetings. So the principle of ASEAN, number one, as I was asking through this birth period of ASEAN, is to make sure that everybody is equal. ASEAN is intergovernmental. In the term of diplomacy, intergovernmental means everybody is equal. No decision will be made using majority vote, because majority vote would undermine certain votes. So the principle that since the very beginning of ASEAN has been upholded is that those who are more able will help others, and those who has been helped will be helped, those who help them in return some other time. And this has been shown in this particular sentence: to promote active collaboration and mutual assistance. So you don't just accept. But once you accept, you return the favor to the country who gives you favor. That's the principle of amity that ASEAN has been upholding. So compared to the UN model, I'm jumping into the UN issue here. Compared to the UN model, it's totally different. In the UN, you notice that the country with the largest GDP would pay the bigger share of fee to run the meetings, to pay for people in the secretariat, and so on and so forth. That's the UN, which is why there's the P5. If you pay more, you get more votes, you get more power, you can block votes. In ASEAN, despite the reality that the economic profile is so different and the size of the economy is also very different, everybody pays the same coming to ASEAN. So there's the ASEAN Fund. ASEAN Fund, every year, it will be monitored by the ambassador of every member states to ASEAN. Will be monitored. Every now and then, there will be increase of contribution, usually following inflation. But again, there's approval. If one country say no to it, then the decision will be postponed or rejected. It will be needs to be retabled. So ASEAN has a funding, and every member state, regardless how rich you are, how big your population is, how successful your market is, you pay the same. So Cambodia pays the same amount to Malaysia, to Singapore. Indonesia, as the largest country, pay the same amount to Brunei Darussalam. So everybody pays equally the same amount for different kinds of mechanisms. So for human rights issue, for instance, we also have ITER fund. So for delivering activities on human rights, every member states agree to collect how much money per year. It's not that amount here is not significant. The importance here is the sense of ownership, that everybody puts the same onto the table, and therefore there is the responsibility that everybody must respect each other's vote. So decision making is based on consensus. And you know what consensus is? I have written on different parts of media. You can always type in my name and search on it. Consensus, there are scholars who understood consensus as everybody must agree. In my own experience, that's wrong. That's inaccurate. Because in order for a consensus to happen, the minimum that needs to be there is that nobody rejects. And you feel the difference? If nobody rejects, you successfully make nobody feel so bad about the idea that they feel that they have to stop the initiative, then it's already a consensus. And that's ASEAN. Then you can put the stamp ASEAN on it as a decision. So in every mechanism, the one that I showed earlier, here, at the sectoral bodies, at the meetings with dialogue partners, the same principle applies. So let me give you the example directly to the UN, for instance. So how influential is the UN in ASEAN? UN is just another body that ASEAN agrees to look up to for certain principles, given it's a treaty body mechanism in the world. It has legally binding treaties that all member states of ASEAN must abide to. But in terms of programs, ASEAN decided to be sovereign. ASEAN decided to initiate their own programs, pool their own efforts, pool their own fund, and then invite the UN to either come as speakers to enlighten ASEAN about SDGs, or to discuss about human rights mechanism, the OHCSR, you know, the Office of High-Ranking Official on Human Rights, or other UN bodies such as from ILO or from IOM, you know, the migration body. When there are problems, they will invite UN bodies to enlighten them on where to go, what can be improved, and then what kind of, sometimes they also organize common activities to engage a broader stakeholders, broader size of stakeholders, for instance. So as a mechanism, they are working parallel, UN and ASEAN. UN never pays to ASEAN. ASEAN member states' decisions to what to do in UN is independent of what ASEAN decides. So these are two separate mechanisms. In ASEAN, we know there's an officer that can always connect us to UN mechanism. I know the person, very talkative and very easygoing person. We can always call him and ask him, can you provide this? Will the UN be interested in doing this? Oh, let me explore it. Then this guy would talk to the UN bodies, desired, and then a conversation can be open, and then we start dialogues on UN related activities. So decision making of ASEAN has been always based on consensus, even when it's about whether or not we make certain activity with UN or with the United States or with whatever, always needs to go through consensus process at the sectoral bodies, at the foreign minister level, at the ambassadors level. Everything needs to be consensus based. Now, what is the impact of Indonesian politics to the organization? It's easily easier. I think it's easier to look at from this chart that I give. Indonesia plays in the realm of ideas more than money or other kinds of resources. Indonesia advanced ASEAN, influenced ASEAN through ideas. Indonesia shapes ASEAN direction through ideas. So Indonesia never pays for activities to happen, but Indonesia throw ideas and then talk it out among ASEAN member states, get initial consensus to move forward to create something bigger. And this is what happened. Summit, it's Indonesian idea. Why it's important to engage a very top executive level in ASEAN to participate in the regional meeting. So it's not just a ministerial level kind of dialogue. The impact can be more strategic if you involve the higher ranking appointed officials or elected officials. Yeah, to some countries it's elected. So the summit is one example, and then the IRF is also initiated initially by Indonesia, Bali Concord 2, the draft, the ideas. But again, Indonesia never want to say, oh, it's Indonesian. Because by saying so, Indonesia undermines the agreements from other countries who decide to support, at least initially support, so that the idea can roll on and move forward. So in terms of regional stability, the ideas of being inclusive to India, China, US, Russia, all the major powers, Indonesia give the examples of being comfortable to engage with them. If you notice, read out some histories about some of the member states in ASEAN, a lot of these countries, especially the smaller size countries, they have been notoriously uncomfortable negotiating with major powers. They either try to avoid engaging with them, or they play in 2 feet. What do you call it? Double standards. They engage both of them and try to get deals from the other, but then do something else with the other. That's usually what it is. But Indonesia is showing the example that if you disagree about something, let's just bring it up to the table, talk it out loud in a forum like the ASEAN regional forum, like the meeting of Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, like the dialogue on COC, for instance, the Code of Conduct on the South China Sea, for instance. That's the bravery of the braveness of Indonesia, is to nurture the nature of dialogue, the habit of dialogue, and expressing yourself, engaging with the major powers with confidence. So I hope I answer all the questions. If you're still need further clarification, please let me know. Any other questions? If not, I would like to just move. I still have until 4:30, right? Or 30 more minutes, right, Salma?
Yes, you have.
Okay. So let me finish up my latest part of the presentation. I think I want to bring you forward to the current situation, yeah, in the world. ASEAN is not perfect. It's as a regional organization, it has been going through so many things, and this is one of the hardest tests at this point in time, because the geopolitics of the region is not about geographic and politics being, being discussed and matched. But now, with the expansion of connectivity around the world, it becomes geostrategic. No matter where you are, you can be very strategic to the major powers. You are not bounded by where you are, which geographic location you're at. So anybody can be very important to the major powers, which is why the discussion of high politics alone will not be sufficient. What I'm trying to for you to look at is the rise of China, right? The rise of China grows the feeling of worry from the United States. And it's all for sensible reasons, yeah? Economically, without taking so many years, China surpassed the economy of the US. And not only that, the US is indebted, having so much debt to sustain its economy. And the larger part is to China. So when there's a big question, usually in the region, the question is, how do we make sure that there's peace in the region, that there is trust between powers in this region, to the point that there won't be any open conflicts happening in the region? That question becomes tricky when the economic capacity of the US declines, and there's a rise of economic capacity of other powers. And if you look bigger, beyond the region of Southeast Asia, you see the Pacific, and you see the world in general, following the Ukraine-Russia conflict, for instance. You start seeing that the US still have relatively large leverage to take whatever it wants to shape the relationship of itself with countries. And it can stir stability in certain region whenever it can. So why is that possible? Well, because US has a prominence not only in the use of dollar, US dollar, it also has a prominence in the technology on weapons, and also the distribution of those defense technology. So when finally the dialogue about Indo-Pacific as a new picture of geography comes into fore, you start to realize that Indo-Pacific is not just about Southeast Asia. It's about competition of power between the US and China. It's about how to exclude one and how to beat one and win over the other. So it's a pretty much zero-sum game that you're talking about. So the logic of cooperation that for so long, until early 2000s, just before the pandemic, has been always about cooperation, expanding cooperation, the network of cooperation, creating framework of cooperation, pulling money together to improve cooperation. Now suddenly change. You either with them or with us. You either win with us or lose. You know, the question has been that. And the US has been very serious in putting together resources to secure this intent. The indicator, among others, is the Indo-Pacific Command. So how China is being perceived as a threat is manifested in the Indo-Pacific Command. It's there, it's operating, and the US not only, you know, establishing all this command in very nearby in Southeast Asia, not far from Indonesia. The United States also stepped out from treaty binding agreements in the UN, namely the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces with Russia. And because of that, Russia also stepped out from the UN agreement on ballistic missile. So lo and behold, there's no binding agreements on weapons. After when 2021, I think, that was the time when Donald Trump announced the AUKUS, the trilateral agreements between the US, UK, and Australia to strengthen Indo-Pacific Command. So this changed the whole discussion about the region. No more it's only about economic cooperation. It becomes a question, a very strategic question about who are you with? What are you going to do to make sure that your country is safe if there's an open conflict somehow between US and China? So the very haunting question in ASEAN is whether ASEAN is now split, whether some member states are dancing to the tune of one and not the other. So these are serious questions, but if you put it in the perspective, this question is not just affecting ASEAN, it's not just affecting Southeast Asian countries, it's affecting the rest of the world as well. This idea of connecting the world that was initially seen as very benign, very sympathizing to the different parts of the world that has been underdeveloped, right? That has been landlocked, that has been underdeveloped because they cannot gain resources. Nobody's going to visit that area. Now their fate has been changed because of the connectivity that China initiated and then followed by other countries, followed by India, followed by Russia, followed by Central Asian countries. The world is now ever more connected than before. And this has implications politically, economically, of course, but politically, that's some things that sometimes we overlook. And so for an archipelagic country like Indonesia, this is a serious, serious issue because as an archipelagic country, this probably Pakistan needs to, to reflect, yeah, because you don't have this problem. we have this problem. We have sea lanes of communication. Sea lanes of communication is basically an area dedicated, according to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, that this area will be open. Anybody passing through this red lanes should be fine. They should have freedom of navigation. They don't have to pay. They don't have to report to us, to Indonesia. But imagine if this connectivity is misused to carry out missiles, weapons, and to do wars in our neck of the wood. This is something that's serious, and these lanes of communication has been used mainly for trade, and 90% of the world trade so far has still been through the sea. And the sea lanes of communications to the Strait of Malacca is very important lane for many countries in the north, up north. So the issue of South China Sea here, affects everybody in the region. And to Indonesia, this is a concerning matter. So saving ourselves, saving our region, Southeast Asian countries, from over-dependency to certain country becomes important. So you notice this trend of de-dollarization is also happening in Southeast Asia, and it's happening quite fast. If you look at this data of how US dollars has been used in 2000, and now in 2002, it was 71.1%, now 58.4% use of US dollar. We start using other currency and doing local currency settlement for trade. So this is to eliminate over dependence to US dollar and to the US. And at this point, Southeast Asia is not necessarily the strongest to contain pressure from the United States. China remains the one that's very strong to do this. But nevertheless, at least we're doing something. At least Southeast Asian countries are doing actively to secure that stability at the political and security level. So I'll stop there. Anybody wish to say anything or ask?
Please raise your hands if you have questions. Okay, I will ask a couple of questions. First of all, what are the prerequisites for country to become part of ASEAN? For example, European Union have strict rules that country must follow in order to become the part of European Union. So what are the prerequisites in case of ASEAN? And the second question is about SAARC, because it is also a regional organization, but we can call it a failed organization because none of the objectives are being achieved by SAARC. So if you ask anybody, they will answer that it is because of the bilateral issues among countries such as Pakistan and India. But don't you think so that regional organizations are meant to overcome such issues? So is it a flaw in the structure of SAARC, or what is it that even after so many years, the SAARC is still a failed organization and cannot achieve the stability in the South Asian area?
Okay. Thank you. Very good questions. The first one about prerequisites to be member. ASEAN at this point has that charter and has that vision, ASEAN vision. So principles of ASEAN and how ASEAN is working, commitments of ASEAN is basically encapsulated in that charter. To become a member, a country needs to agree to comply to all of that, all the procedures, all the way of engaging with member states needs to be, according to the not only rules but also tradition. They call it norms, norms in ASEAN, which is why in ASEAN there's a step-by-step process for a country to get to become members, from observer to other more engaging status, so that not only they know how the requirements procedurally, technically, and the requirements needed for all agencies, because ASEAN now engaged not only the foreign ministers, but also a large number of ministries and agencies, including the police force, for instance. They need to be familiar with it. And number two is the norms. The norms, the way we come into a decision, the way we raise concerns, it's very particular. So, which is why experience matters. If you have participated in ASEAN several times, then you start feeling the vibes, The thing about SARCs, if I may, this is just my 2 cents, I guess, because I've never been to SARC's meeting, which makes me aware that there's a limitation to what I'm trying to say. But I've been to other meetings where SARC's members are there in the same room. ASEAN member states, there's a restraining feeling. Every time you disagree about something, you don't say it up front on the on the table right away. You talk to each other first, and then if there's still disagreement, then you raise it to the point that still allow for good communication. Whereas in the case of SARC's member, even if it's not SARC's meeting, their differences is very, very blunt, very open, and very, I should say, harsh, yeah? Their statements can be very harsh to each other, which lock in, what do you call it? Not lock in, which hinder further communication on anything. Once you attack something that's very fundamental to the identity of that country, then end of conversation. The issue of nuclear war, for instance, nuclear weapons, for instance, has always been one of the very sensitive issue. I would think that usually because it has been there for a long time and it's not something that will change in a short term, there should be a mechanism inside of SARC that take that as a reality rather than something they continue to try to fix. It's one thing. In ASEAN, for instance, we realized that some member states would have difficulty conforming to the path and pace of other ASEAN member states, be it on the issue of, I'm talking about the example of human rights, for instance, and then in other mechanism, there's also the issue of economic cooperation. There are member states that will always be lag behind. Why? Because they don't have the resources that are at par with other member states. They too have tend to have very big resistance to initiatives on that matter. So what do? We create a split mechanism. So when we talk about that topic in economic, for instance, there is a consensus -1. So if you decided that you cannot go into the same pace, then there will be an exception created, so long as then you develop measures, announce the measures that will be taken to achieve the level that would allow you to be on the same level with other member states. On the issue of human rights, usually the mechanism imply visiting, experiencing, the situation, like for instance, the standard of detention center or the prison, for instance. If you want to say you disagree to torture, one thing you have to understand is how then you avoid torture, right? A place where torture might happen is in the detention center. So you visit detention center in different parts of ASEAN, learn from it, see, and then think of how step by step you can develop, and then we revisit the plan. So there are things that cannot be denied, is very much a gap between countries. So that should be taken as it is rather than as something to attack. Maybe that only speaks a little about SARS, but I hope that that sheds some light onto how ASEAN works too.
Yes, got it.
Okay. All right. I guess time is up. I appreciate the time to share here at Bahria University. Thank you so much also to the Embassy of Indonesia for arranging this. Hopefully it's been useful for you, and come over to Southeast Asian countries. Come visit us. You'll see so many interesting things that unless you experience, you may not, feel what I'm talking about, what I've been talking about. But it's all about, it's all very nice in here. Please come over.
Inshallah, we will.
Okay.
Okay.
So
Thank you. It was a wonderful session, and we got to learn a lot. Thank you so much.
thank you so much. Okay. Thank you, Mas Zulfikar or KBRI Islamabad izin ya. Bye-bye, everyone.